All right, a quick introduction. So the wonderful Shannon Donnelly is here to present her third Zoom presentation, this one on curry houses, coffee shops, and other offbeat places to eat. Thank you so much, Shannon.
Thank you. I hope you all are not tired of my voice by now. So let's talk a little bit about places to eat in London other than your home. Uh, Taverns, I want to put a little context on the names because it can get confusing and they're so often muddled together. It's not an era where there was clear cut, yeah, this is, California Pizza Kitchen and that's that. It was a little more flexible era. So there are taverns. That's the old-fashioned name. They're starting to be known instead as public houses, and they'll become known in the Victorian era as pubs. So these are places that serve wine, ale, porter, stout, brandy. They may have meals. They might be a tavern and inn or a hotel and tavern. There's a lot of combinations that you see in names, but tavern is the old-fashioned name that's going out of fashion, basically. Then there are coffee houses that serve hot and cold drinks. They have newspapers. They started turning into subscription based, like Lloyd's of London, where you pay a fee to subscribe to it as well as pay for your coffee. Uh, and then some of them also started turning into the gentlemen's clubs. They also in the 1800s start serving food. So they start off originally just coffee, cocoa, tea, maybe some cold drinks, and then move into serving food and being attached to a hotel or inn or tavern. And then there are eating houses that are strictly eating houses. They don't have other functions. These could be oyster houses, chop houses, pastry shops, confectioners, cook shops, fish shops, and we'll talk about all those differences a little bit. And then finally, you have street fare. Basically, anything you can hold in your hand and eat on the go could be purchased on the street. And in the Victorian era, this hugely takes off. It's starting to emerge in the late 1700s, really becomes a thing more in the 1800s. And then in Victorian era, it's the way to get something cheap to eat. So general eating hours. Breakfast is almost always eaten at home. There's only 3 locations listed for breakfast in the Epicure's Almanac of 1815. They include the Tavistock Breakfast Rooms, which is part of the Tavistock Hotel and Coffee House in Covent Garden. That's not to say that a coffee house would not serve coffee or breakfast in the morning, but it's usually breakfast per se is really something that they figure you'll eat at home. If you're in a hotel or a inn that has where you're staying, they would have breakfast available to their guests. It's usually a fairly light meal in the Regency time. In town, it's usually toast. A lot of foreigners note that they think toast is this wonderful invention. And toast is usually made by the people eating the toast. There are toasting forks, so usually toast your toast with a fork by the fire. It doesn't arrive cold or anything like that. So toast and coffee, toast and tea, toast and cocoa. You might have buns or muffins available as well in the morning. The big, huge breakfast that we think of is usually more associated with countryside, or it becomes a big thing that English breakfast becomes a big thing in an Edwardian era. Dinner is generally served between 12 and 4. You will see some places that are open 12 to 6, but usually 12 to 4 is about the dinner hour. Aristocrats and the fashionable dine later. So dinner had started off as an earlier, almost what we think of as lunchtime, and then moves later and later and later. And supper is the late evening meal. So the in between breakfast and dinner, lunch and lunching are pretty much used as a verb at this era. It's called a light snack. It's served in some places, and we'll talk about how some places also have soup all day. That's a big thing. And then supper is a late meal. So supper is offered at balls, the evening supper. It can be offered in homes, and it's usually offered at establishments that are close to entertainments. So they're going to take advantage of people coming out of Astley's or Covent Garden Theatre or the Royal Theatre and offer up a supper. This is why it's called supper at Vauxhall, because it's a late evening meal as opposed to that middle of the day meal. So who ate out? we have a nice image here of a wait staff, a lady, barmaid bringing out what looks like probably a chop of some kind and either a bowl of soup or a covered plate out to a diner in either a tavern or a coffee house. And you can see somebody behind her bringing a basket full of bread and a couple of mugs of ale. And a dog is there waiting to get the handouts, probably the bones. So you can see it's a pretty casual arrangement here. You could have booths or you might have benches or you might have both in any coffee house. Gentlemen lacking a club would eat out at a coffee shop or a tavern or chop house. Men in trade would definitely eat out. And you'll see a lot of coffee houses are really centered around Cornhill and the Royal Exchange and the places where you do business. Working class men would eat out. And there are a lot of working class men in London because there's a lot of building going on in the early 1800s. So a lot of construction going on, meaning day laborers, carpenters, stonemasons, all of those people who do work. Travelers, men will dine in public, family or ladies in private parlors or suites with a sitting room. So a hotel would have a suite with a sitting room or a parlor where the meal would be set out for them. In general, the women are going to be proprietors of the coffee house or the wait staff or barmaids, or they are not going to be ladies at all. No lady of respectability goes into eat in public, except for an exception. We'll talk about that exception later. So I wanted to give you a map. This is 1824 that kind of shows the districts. So you can see the fashionable west end of Mayfair over here near Hyde Park, right over here. And next to it is Soho, which has a lot of the international, the French places and so forth. Very fashionable is down here is St. James, and Piccadilly runs through here. And then as you go east, you get into the city over here. And then Southwark starts to become a little on the edge there, more working class. Same with Westminster. And then Chelsea is definitely more working class, middle class. Kensington is a small village off to the west here that you might go out to for a day affair. But when we're talking fashionable, we were talking the Mayfair, the West End of London, very much so. And then if you're talking the city, you're talking around Fleet Street, Soho, Covent Garden area. And nobody goes up to Primrose Hill or the north of town or Marylebone unless you're like going for an excursion. So the coffee houses themselves date back to the mid 1600s. That's when coffee becomes a huge thing. Initially, there's a lot of resistance. The men love it. The women are like, my husband's in the coffee house all day and never comes home and complaining about it. It's the place for men to do business, read newspaper, catch up on ship news. So that's where Lloyd's of London starts out. It might be subscription based, as in Lloyd's, and that was not the only subscription based. And that's where the gentlemen's clubs start forming around it. The clubs start to replace them for the upper class, but they're still numerous in the Regency era. So in the 1700s, they're still pretty popular, and into the 1800s. And then they might be attached to a business, an inn or a hotel. Tattersall's also served coffee and kept a register of bets. So Tattersall's acted sort of like a little coffee house as well. And when people talk about coffee or tea, almost always both are served. So this is Cornhill. This is Horwood's map. This shows 1799. Here's the Royal Exchange up on the left. This is Cornhill Street here. And you can see the Jamaica Wine House over here, King's Arm, Jonathan's, Garraway's. A lot of coffee shops in this area near Cornhill to kind of service the people that were coming in. And Lloyd's will eventually move into the Royal Exchange itself and change its location. Now, this is modern Cornhill to kind of give you an idea of what still survives. Simpson's Tavern is here, and Simpson's Tavern, we talk about it having an ordinary, meaning it's got a set meal that it serves, and its ordinary was kind of fish-based. Simpson's Tavern is still in existence. It's one of the oldest tavern coffee houses. The Jamaica Wine House is still here, and you can see some of the other ones here that are around. The Cat and Dandy, the George and Vulture, some fun ones are still around here. But definitely the city, these coffee houses are kind of centered around the city and Covent Garden area. So in Mayfair, we still have a few fancy coffee houses. Jacquier's Coffee House on Bond Street, that's attached to the Clarendon Hotel. So that's the fancy French restaurant, basically, of the Clarendon. So if you're eating at Clarendon, you'll either have the coffee house main room that you can eat in, they'll have private parlors, or they'll send a meal up to your suite and set it up in your room if you're a family or a lady. Mountain Coffee House is on Grosvenor Street. Grover's Coffee House is on Brook Street. Blenheim Coffee House and Tavern is on New Bond Street. That's noted as being opposite Owen and Bentley's Fruit Shop. So that would be opposite a fruit shop where you could get luxurious fruits like pineapple. And York Coffee House on St. James First Street. So you can see there's a fair number of coffee houses scattered around. In the Epicure's Almanac, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of coffee houses. So spread all over London. This is an 18th century view. Now, in the 1600s and 1700s, ladies did come to houses. They would often come in with a husband to either have a coffee or dine or have a tea. And you can see the kind of benches that they would sit on while they're having coffee. These are hats hung up on pegs on the back here, and some nice windows for the coffee house. And even a child is welcome into the coffee house. So that's more. And then as we get into the 1800s, it becomes a place where women are not really welcome unless they are not very respectable. And some coffee shops would even ban women completely. So there are specialties for coffee houses. There are some that are business and trade only. There are some that cater to theater custom. So they have playbills up on the wall, they promote plays. That's really their target audience. There are some that cater to exotic, like the East India Company around the Docklands area, serving sailors who are in from West India, from West Indies, India, China, Africa. Others are attached to businesses like a hotel or inn or tavern. And some have a custom bill of fare, like some will specialize only in, let's say, pies, or some specialize in roasts, or some will specialize in soups. They'll advertise if they have venison in, or something specialty like that, like turtles. And then they will customize their decor to attract their audience in as well. So you can kind of see a little of this customization here with Papworth Auction House and Coffee House. It's a very, if you compare that with a picture of the 1700s, this is definitely into the 1800s. It's all gentlemen. We have private booths here now, a lovely kind of Grecian classical decor instead of the more casual benches. And we have beautiful skylights here and a curved arch ceiling. So this is both an auction house, and we can see gentlemen here reading the newspapers and catching the news of the days as they have their coffee. So much more higher class coffee house here now. So this is from the picture of London 1805, and it talks about some of the coffee houses in the vicinity of the Royal Exchange and Lloyd's. So you can see here how we've got some of those specialties here. The African and Singal Coffee House, it's frequented by merchants and captains trading to those parts, to Africa and Singal. So dinner from 2 to 5 every day. They advertise that they have good wines and lodgings as well. The Jamaica Coffee House, again, frequented by West India merchants. Dinners are dressed there on site. That means the meat is dressed on site. And beds can be made up or procured if you're going to stay overnight. So you can see how the coffee houses are serving a little bit like inns as well. Jerusalem and East India Coffee House, again, frequented by merchants, gentlemen concerned with the East India Company, investments, and they're fitted up in an elegant style for subscribers. So this is a coffee house where you must be a subscriber. The Carolina and Honduras Coffee House, Birchin Lane, Cornhill, again, frequented by merchants. This is trading to America. So dinners are dressed in the afternoon, beds made up. Excellent punch is one of their advertisements. Will's Coffee House, Bank Building, Cornhill, Again, merchants, brokers, traders to Spain and Oporto. That would be down in Portugal. Dinners dressed in the afternoon and beds can be procured. The Bank Coffee House opposite the Bank of England. And this is stockbrokers and blank clerks here. Dinners are dressed in good wines. Stock Exchange Coffee House over the Stock Exchange in Threadneedle. Again, merchants, bankers, people in trade. And again, excellent dinners, beds can be procured. American and New England Coffee House, again, frequented by merchants. And then Lloyd's Subscription Coffee House. So this is a list in 1807 of papers that might be available in the coffee house. So we have morning papers that are available, evening papers, some are available every day, and then some on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, some on Tuesday and Saturday. And then we have morning papers, evening papers, and then weekly papers and Sunday papers on the right. So if you look down at the bottom on the right there, you can see the different papers. So something like the British Press, the Morning Post comes out every morning. The London Gazette comes out in the evening. But these are the type of papers that would be available. And this is in the handout, so don't feel like you have to write all of these down. So this is the exterior of the Gloucestershire Coffee House. You can see how busy the street is. Those coaches with people up on top, those are stages or mail coach. Whenever you see that R, that scrolling R, like over here on the right-hand side with that coach, that is the Royal Mail symbol. The other coaches are letting off people for the coffee house. We have some nice blankets on the horses here, meaning it's a rather cold day. We have a nice little gig in the foreground here on the lower left and another little cart on the lower right, kind of a low-class vehicle here, and another cart just behind it, tucked behind it. There are some people standing on the side. This is Joseph Miller, fish salesman, Billingsgate. And over here we have a lady at the coffee house standing on the balcony, a couple of ladies and a child kind of watching the commotion that's going on. So the coffee house themselves would always front onto the road, usually with some nice windows to give you both light and advertise the coffee and entice you in. And this is obviously a combination coffee house and hotel or inn. So inside the coffee house, in the 17th century, the coffee room usually opened off the street. At first, only tables and chairs were spread about on a sanded floor. Later, this arrangement was succeeded by the boxes or booth, such as appear in the Rowlandson caricature, the picture of the interior of Lloyd's, etc. The laws were decorated with handbills and posters advertising the quack medicines, pills, tinctures, salves, and electricies of the period, all of which might be purchased at the bar near the entrance, presided over by a prototype of the modern English barmaid. There were also bills of the play, auction notices, depending on the character of the place. So that's where you can see it's decorated for purpose, whether they're a theater or whether they're more for auction houses or for businesses. Then as now, the barmaids were made much of by patrons. Tom Brown refers to them as the charming fillies, who invite you by their amorous glances into their smoky territories. So this is that Rowlandson etching that he talked about. We've got a waiter here serving at a bench and table. And then we have the booths over there on the left. And you'll notice this is all gentlemen's being served, except for the barmaid in the center here who's carrying a mug of something, and a couple of dogs who are probably baking bones. Meat was the order of the day, so there was usually bones to be gotten rid of somehow. So what might you eat? It's going to be whatever's in season being served. There are no menus. So the coffee house serves what the coffee house wants to serve and what they can get and what the cook knows how to prepare. The Torrington Diaries, which is the tours through England and Wales of the Honorable John Byng. A London gentleman steps into a coffee house, orders venison and turtle. In the instant, and if known, a delicious bottle of port or claret upon a clean cloth without form. He dines at the moment of his appetite and walks away at the moment he is satisfied. So turtle and venison were considered status symbols. Turtle sells for 4 shillings or more a pound. That's a lot of money then. So it's an expensive dish. There was a mock turtle soup made from a calf's head, seasoned with herbs, eggs, Madeira, cayenne pepper, and other West Indies spices that would imitate the sea turtles. Some places advertised that they had live turtles that they kept on site. Other people would notice when they had turtles in from the West Indies in season. So turtles came in and out of season, same with venison. So in the Epicure's Almanac, they talk about the Worcestershire Coffee House announced in the newspaper when venison season began with them. They had prime haunches at 3 shillings and sixpence each person. So it's a pretty expensive meal when you can usually get a meal for a couple of pence, like 6 pence. Woodley had shellfish and oysters, as good a mart for various ships, fish that supplied the table of gentry as any. Cheshire cheese, they had recommendations to call ahead and order your dinner an hour or two beforehand. And by calling ahead, they do not mean that you phone them. They mean that you send a note around with a boy who's going to take it for you for a few pence. Their hours are between noon and 6, so they're open a little later than a lot of the other ones. And as we noted, a lot of them note soups at the ready all day or for any time of day. So it was easy to keep a soup on the fire. These places usually generally cooked over open fires. So roasts and boiled things were very common. Every foreigner talks about how the English love their roasts, love their boiled, and they talk about how vegetables are almost always served with a sauce that's made of butter and flour, and that's about it. That's how they're dressed. So curry houses. Curry had come in with the East India Company into England. Norris Street Coffee House and Haymarket offered the true curry, Indian curry paste, and you'll notice how they spelled it with a EY instead of RRY. They did curry and rice, and they also did Indian pilaws to any part of the town. So they would actually deliver to you in 1773. The Jerusalem Coffee House catered to East India Company merchants, so they like to have a curry on the menu of some kind. The Hindustani Dinner and Hookah Smoking Club, that opened up about 1808 and it closed about 3 years later. They advertised themselves as the manufacturer of the real curry powder. They were decorated with bamboo cane chairs and Eastern flair. The proprietor, he wasn't the cook. We don't know who the cook was, but the proprietor, Sheikh Dean Mohammed, went on to other successful businesses after this closed, and the hookah club continued on as a coffee house until the 1830s under different management. So this was a book that was actually found and sold not too long ago for about 8,000 pounds. It's actually the recipe book from the Hindustani Coffee House showing it's they had to offer. And in the handout, I call out some of the things that they had for here for their recipes and how much they were charging on their menu. You'll notice they had it in a book, but they did not post it. So this would be on a chalkboard, most likely near the entrance to show what was available and how much it cost. So this is where they talk about what's in the book. It listed 25 Indian dishes. The Meki Pula, which is usually a rice dish, was £1, 1 shilling. The pineapple pula was £1, 16 shillings. A chicken curry was 12 shillings. A lobster curry was 12 shillings. A kuma of lamb or veal was 8 shillings. And this came out with breads, chutneys, and other exclusively Indian dishes. It didn't attract enough custom to stay active. In other words, the casual people, they like their occasional Indian dish, but they didn't come to an Indian specific restaurant. So curries had become a part of the British food in general. Ketagri is a version of the Indian dish khichdi, and it was brought back and it becomes a traditional English breakfast dish later on in the 18th century and goes on through Victorian era. Curry and rice were house specialties in many of the eating houses in Piccadilly area. So while you might not find a specific India house, you'll often find it as one of the main featured dishes that they have, particularly if their custom is trade is for the East India Company. Duncan MacDonald, the head cook at the Bedford Tavern and Hotel in Covent Garden, published the New London Family Cookbook in 1811 and included a curry recipe in that. There were curry recipes going back to Hannah Glass in the 1740s. Mulligatawny soup also becomes a common recipe, and that's an adaptation of South Indian cookings. So historicuk.com reports that between 1820 and 1840, the import of turmeric, which is the primary ingredient in curry, increased threefold. So a lot of spices are coming into England at this time period that are changing kind of the flavor of English cooking. Now we're on to oyster houses. Oysters were extremely popular in this era through the 1700s and into the 1800s, up until the time that industrialization, basically the pollution of the Thames, over harvesting them, and the lack of child labor to actually go harvest them caused them to become a luxury item. So these were a casual item, they were not a luxury item. They could be served raw, pickled, potted. And when you pot something, basically what you're doing is you're using a clay jar and you're cooking what you have slightly, and then you're putting clarified butter over the top. So you usually cook it in a little bit of butter, which clarifies it. You take out the milk solids from the butter, and that leaves you a nice seal then on the top of the pot. And you can pot almost anything. You can pot fish, you can pot beef, you can pot pork. So potting was a great way to serve up a lot of different things. Oysters might be boiled. Again, there's that common of boiling everything. They could be baked, fried. They were often used in pies. They were put into sausages to extend the meat out because they were so cheap, or they were very common in sauces. You get a lot of recipes for oyster sauces that go over poultry, like chicken or turkey. So that's a very common thing. Rules, which is one of the posh restaurants in existence today in London, if you ever get a chance to eat there, it's fabulous, was established in 1798 as Oyster Stall in Maiden Lane. So a lot of the restaurants kind of got their start. We talked about Shepherd's Tavern as well, having oysters. The Epicure's Almanac lists 14 eating shops selling oysters specifically, 5 unnamed oyster shops, and that doesn't include oysters sold on the street. And the illustration here at the right shows a gentleman with a cane buying oysters from a lady who's just shucked them. You can see the oyster knife in her hand. Again, there's a dog looking for handouts. And another lady is with him dressed quite nicely with a lovely hat with a feather, also got an oyster in her hands. And then there's a basket of oysters, probably for the empty shells down at her side, and a tin in front of her on a little like folding table where she is actually pulling the raw oysters out. Billingsgate Market was right next to the Thames, and that's where many people got their oysters from and then took them out on the street to sell them. So this is an illustration from the English Spy by Cruikshank of the Hall of Infamy, alias the Oyster Saloon in Bridges Street. This is a fight at 4 a.m. and you can see the crowd is getting very rowdy here. All of the women in this are not respectable. These are fair Cyprians. You can see there's a lady right at the center brandishing a wine bottle. She's about to crown a gentleman with a top hat over the head. There's another man to her side who's looks like he's trying to start a fist fight. And a gentleman hanging off the pole with a cane, I guess, trying to block the bottle over the head. Lots of people watching what's going on. Many people sitting at tables or looking like they're propositioning some ladies over to the side there. So quite a rowdy evening is being had at 4 a.m. here in this particular evening. And again, there's the dog sitting there barking at things, looking for the handout of maybe some oysters. So a chop house. Chop means simply any cut of meat. This can be pork chop, lamb chop, beef chops, any chop. It can be ham. Beef and ham were sold everywhere, very common. The English love their ham, and the nice thing about ham is because it's smoked, it lasts, so you're not likely to have it go off. It was often boiled or roasted. These are the most common recipes. A chop house typically is an inexpensive meal. So this is where you're going for a very fixed meal. And this chop house might be attached to a shop where you could purchase meat by the weight. And you could often get, if you could get it by the weight, They would often give you slices of meat and bread, and you could put your sandwich together on the go. So that could be bought. Dressed means the meat is butchered and cleaned on the site. Like if you field dress a deer, that means you've cleaned it and field dressed it to take it home. So if you're dressing the meat on site, that means they're actually killing the meat on the site and dressing it there for you. That assures you that you're getting the freshest meat possible. It's not hanging in a meat locker somewhere or out where it might be getting old and flies on it and all sorts of other problems. In this chop house to the right, we see gentlemen in booths being served by a waiter who's bringing what looks like a bowl of soup and a mug of ale, probably to some diners here. And again, you can see the decor in the background. Uh, they would be variable. A nice place might have some portraits or paintings hung on the wall, maybe some cups or some decorations, whereas a lower class place would be bare walls. And this is a nice leg of a mutton down here in a picture. So the ordinary, a lot of people would chop houses would just have the ordinary, and the ordinary was whatever they were serving that day. There's no menus until later in the 1800s. There are in Paris, but not in London. Uh, a beef, mutton, ham, bacon, game, poultry, fish. They ate head to tail. So you get oxtail soup. You get a cheek of jowl of a pig. You get ham. You get trotters, pig feet. You get everything going into the meals and being served up. This shows you, the illustration shows you some joints that were available. A round of beef, there's a calf set in there, there's a ham, there's a haunch of mutton. Mutton is most common because lamb was expensive. If you have a lamb, you want it to grow up and produce more sheep. If you have an older sheep, a mutton, who is not producing more sheep for you, she's going to go to market. So that's the idea why there's so much more mutton. These days in this world, we see a lot of lamb in the marketplace because it tastes better, but we have factory farming that produces that lamb instead of a farmer who wants to keep his herd as large as possible. You get a lot of pies. They're mostly meat, but you also get fish. Eel is very popular and very tasty if you've never had it. I know it doesn't sound that good, but a freshwater eel is really lovely. You get some apple uh, and some other fruit pies, but it's mostly savory. Bread and cheese are very popular, particularly toasted bread and cheese. And then soups, oxtail, white soup, and this is an illustration showing the ever popular white soup that would be served up. Pea soup, very common, very popular pea soup. Over and over again, you don't see many vegetables mentioned, but peas are very popular. Everybody loves those. And then oyster soup as well. So this is a restaurant. Beauvalaire's opened a restaurant in Paris in the late 1700s and produced what is known as the first menu. And it caught on, and there were other restaurants in Paris. So Paris is ahead of the game as far as having cafes, having restaurants, having menus. Beauvalaire's had to close his restaurant at the Palais Royal because of his connections to aristocrats. He reopened, but it didn't do so well, and he closed again. But the idea of menus caught on and would spread to England in Victorian and Edwardian times. So light fare. If you just want a quick snack or you don't have much money, Welsh rabbit or rarebit, it was cheese on toast. And this is kind of a, to my mind, a bit of a sloppy Welsh rarebit here, shown on a nice pewter plate with a typical fork and knife of the late 1700s. You'll notice it only has the two tines on it for the fork. That was very common, late 1700s. Poached or boiled eggs. Eggs were cheap. You could get them poached or boiled, and very easy meal to have. And then soups of all kinds. Easy to put on, low cost. This is where vegetables might go into the pot and be served up. And then roast potatoes. They were only 3 pence each with butter and pepper. And you could buy them on the street or in many of the taverns. So roast potatoes were quite common. And then tarts. Tarts were easy to make, cheap, very affordable. So this is kind of a recipe for salmagundi from a new system of domestic cookery, 1806, and you can kind of see a salmagundi up in this upper right-hand corner. This is more what they talk about when they talk about a salad. We think of salads in this modern era as being primarily lettuce, whereas back then their salads were more like salad was used as a way to dress vegetables. That's all they meant with salad. So we're talking really, it's cold chicken or veal, yolks of boiled eggs, white of the egg, parsley, half dozen anchovies, beetroot, red pickled cabbage, ham, grated tongue, anything well flavored and of good color. Some people like a small portion of London, but it may be better omitted. You use a saucer or a large teacup or other base, and then you make rows around it, widening out and growing smaller at the top, choosing the ingredients for their color. And at the top, a little sprig of curled parsley may be stuck in. So that's the salmagundi as a type of a general vegetable dish that you might have. But notice how much meat is still in it. Even though there are a few vegetables, we're still focused on meat being the primary ingredient. So Soho is where you get a lot of international influence. You have Greek Street offering some Greek food. There's German, Italians, French food, because all of these people are settling in the Soho area. Soho has been international since the 1600s, and the French Huguenots started settling in that area. You have international influence in recipes, as in to dress a turtle the West Indian way. Fish might be done up in the Jewish fashion. It was the precursor to fish and chips. So we don't actually have fish and chips available, but the Jewish fish battered and fried in olive oil, it's said to be very tasty, and it is in the Duke Street Market area. Limehouse also comes into existence with a Limehouse cut in this area, and it will become the China district in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But even in this Regency era, there's a small settlement of Chinese in the Limehouse area. And then the docks cater to sailors from all over the world. So around the dock area is the place to look for any kind of international or really offbeat place. So this is Soho Square in 1812. An interesting thing about it is you see a drover and he's got his dogs with him and he's driving some cattle and it looks like some sheep to market. So these would actually be driven to a restaurant or inn or tavern if they're going to dress the meat there, kill it, slaughter it there, or they might be driven to a market, either Covent Garden or Smithfield Market, where it was one of the main meat markets for sale. So your food comes in on the hoof. It comes in live. Same thing with the fish coming out of the market at Billingsgate. It's going to be out of the ocean, out of the sea. You want it as fresh as possible for it. And you can kind of see in the background here, a nice carriage. This is a post chase. You can tell because it's got a postilion up on the horse and the yellow body that gives it away as a post chase and pair. That was a hired carriage that is stopping in the square right here. So other places to eat. Confectionery and pastry shops are the one place where ladies are welcome and invited in, and they often have chairs where you can sit and have an ice or have a pastry or have a sweet and some tea or cordial and enjoy a good chat. And it can be with a gentleman or with another lady. It is the one place that is a respectable place for ladies to go to. So those are good places to be. Our illustration on the right shows more of a lady with her daughter buying some sweets that are available and being measured out. And these would be wrapped up in a twist of paper to take with you if you were not eating them. They did have chocolates. They did have bonbons. They had comfits, which were nice little seeds that were wrapped and spun in sugar. Very difficult process to make. The handout talks about a lot of the different pastry and sweets that were available in these pastry cook shops or confectioners. Tea gardens were another place that you could go to eat. These were more for middle class. It was like the middle class place to go, maybe for a little entertainment, to get a little bit of the countryside if you live in the city. And they were often kind of just on the edge of the city. So on the south bank of the Thames is a great place for them. And then the street vendors had hand carts and stalls. Street vendors didn't have to pay a tax for having a house or a place of residence. That's why they were made more money. And then, as we talked about cook shops, some butchers sold cooked meat and bread to go for a sandwich on the go, and sandwich was in use in this era. And Duke's Place had an annual Jewish fair with kosher food and unleavened bread. So Jewish food could be bought in London in this era. So going beyond Gunter's, Gunter's obviously is the best known pastry sweet shop. Ferentz's, ladies generally regale their younger friends and relatives with bonbons from Ferentz's. Bonbons start off with the French royalty in the 1600s as bite-sized candies covered in a chocolate shell. They're filled with a candy fruit. They're given in ornate containers, and they often also have a little treat or toy or charm or something in the middle of them. Bonbon, good. So they're good on the outside and they're good on the inside. And they do come over to England. Waud and Mayfair, appointed to the Prince Regent and Duke of York, they also served bonbon. They also supplied refreshments for public masquerades. Owen and Bentley Fruit Shop, New Bond Street, where we talked about that was opposite one of the hotels. They had jellies, ices, liqueurs, maybe had for yourself and the ladies. Wood's Pastry Shop in Bond Street had pastries available. Barker on Bond Street, all the sweet of both Indies. Dawson's Fruit Shop had a royal warrant for both fruit and confections. So that would be a place that you might go to get luxury items like pineapples. Birch's in Cornhill is mentioned in 1814 visit to London with superior soups and pastry. And Parmenter's was confectioner to the Prince Regent and Duke of York and Kent. So this is actually a wholesale receipt from Parmenter's. It is dated 1802, or I believe, no, 1812. And the Epicure's Almanac notes that here are to be had preserves and conserves, wet and dry, jellies, jams, colored transparent pastes, fruit dried or preserved in French brandies, comfits, lozenges, drops of every color and flavor, superior macaroons, root cake, and the most fanciful forms with ices and creams. So they had flavors too that we would not think of in the modern era, like Parmesan ice cream. Not something that comes to mind for ice cream these days. But a lot of these sweets too, this would be your dessert phase of a meal if you were serving at home. So dessert comes from the French word désir, to clear off. So you'd clear off your second course, you'd put out the desserts, and these would be little finger food that you could pick up and eat. Little comfits, dried fruit, extremely popular, preserves, very popular, or you could go into the confectioners for a treat. So the tea gardens, they start up at about the same time as coffee houses in the late 1600s. They're very popular in the 1700s, and then they start to phase out. Part of that is because of the growth of London. London land becomes very expensive, and these tea gardens would be on like 3 to 5 acres or so. So it became more cost effective to close them down, sell the land type of thing. Some inns do add tea gardens. They're usually, like we said, on the edges of London where there is a little more land, and as London grows, they kind of get pushed out. Also, as the railway expands in the 1840s and 16s, now with a railway, you can actually go to the countryside. You don't need a tea garden in the city. You can go out to a countryside inn that has a tea garden, a much better day outing type of thing. And then hotels become popular for tea in Victorian era and Edwardian era with tea rooms and tea shops that open up. So the tea gardens are on the edge of going out of fashion, but still there for the middle class. So a few of the gardens, Cumberland Gardens was near Vauxhall Gardens. It could be rented for large or small parties. It had extensive larder and wines. It also had a bowling green and a cricket green available. Kilburn Wells was in Hampstead. Adam and Eve in Tottenham Court. It's noted that the original site was demolished in 1805, and as Tottenham Court kind of got built up, it got closed in and got a dubious reputation with prostitution and criminal activity going on. It was reopened as a tavern in 1813 and noted as being still there and quite pretty, but a little bit on the edge, a little dicey, and then finally closed down. And I have a few more gardens in the handout as well. So now we have the street vendors. We have a nice illustration here with a gentleman serving gingerbread from his little cart. Gingerbread was very popular. The pie man with eel pies, mutton pies, pork pies, beef pies. Uh, the London Labor and London Poor book from Henry Mayhew has a quote: "Toss the pie man a penny, he calls you heads or tail. If he calls it right, he keeps the penny and no pie for you." So you could kind of bet with some of the pie man. That's a little more Victorian, but that's the idea. Pies were basically a penny, so very cheap, easy food to get. The Muffin Man from Covent Garden, another kind of figure of legend. Banbury cakes were sold, sausages, black puddings, hot peas, and then there were oyster stalls and carts. And oysters are always said to be best in months with R in them. So like January has an R in it, February has an R in it, March. The reason for that is in the months without R, that's through late spring, summer, that's the breeding season for oysters. So you kind of want to leave them alone and not harvest them then. And also it said that they have kind of a milky white liquid in them during the breeding season. And so many hold that they are not as flavorful during that. Many also hold that oysters taste better in the full moon. I'm not sure about that one, but that was a common idea. So costs. Dinners in hotels, they were charged by the dish, but in coffee houses, taverns, inn, the charge was generally per head. So it could range from anything from 6 shillings, 6 pence to 12 shillings for kind of an upper class meal there. In eating houses, everything included dinner was anything from a shilling, 3 pence to 2 shillings, 6 pence. Several comments in the almanac, that's the Epicure's Almanac, suggest that a penny was considered an adequate tip for any waiter. And that would be true in a coffee house too. So your coffee would cost you a penny or 2 pence, and then you'd tip the waiter as well with a pence. Some bills note up to £1 per dinner per person, plus charges for any wine or other drink. Soda water and bottled mineral water are available. Schweppes had gone into business in the 1700s and moved into London in the late 1790s. So you could get Schweppes soda water, or you could get bottled mineral water was available. And it's often seen on some of the bills as well as being part of that. So you weren't drinking plain tap water, you were drinking soda water or bottled mineral water. Soda water was also created with soda powders as well. So this is what still exists. You can see here Simpson's Cavern. This is their modern day photo of their entrance down an alley into the tavern. Their original dates back to 1757. They've actually restored the original decor, and they call themselves the original Chop House in London. The Bell and Fleet Street still exists. The Cheshire's Cheese in Fleet Street all exists. The Georgian Vulture still exists, and the Cock and Woolpack and Finch Lane still exists. So these are places you could still go to and, while not having quite an original meal, have something fairly close. There is a Georgian society in England and London that will serve up original Georgian meals in an original Georgian setting too. That's one place I would love to go to. So a few fun facts. The Hanovers, and we're starting with George I here, brought a German food influence over, including Hanover ham, Metwurst sausages, and ham produced from the acorn-fed pigs raised in the forests of Westphalia. That is that lovely Westphalia ham that people rave about during the Regency, very much an upper-class ham. London's first Italian restaurant is believed to have been the Italian Eating House just off Leicester Square, owned by the Venetian Joseph Moretti between 1803 to 1805. So if you're looking for an Italian restaurant or eating house to go out to, that's the place to take your characters to. In 1764, the Gentleman's Magazine estimated 20,000 Black people lived in London, having their own inns, pubs, and other places. And this is where the Epicure's Almanac is a little lacking. The Epicure's Almanac is written by somebody who's going sort of for the classic middle to rich eating houses, upper class, and avoiding certain areas of town, and kind of not very complimentary about other things like the Jewish population. So he definitely, the writer of that from 1815 has those 1815 prejudices and did not include that. So we're still finding a lot of information about people of color in London. There's a recent article put out about the black sailors served under Nelson. So you can include a lot of things like that. Apples could be baked, roasted apples, by street vendors using just charcoal and a tin plate. So that was a very common treat. Tomatoes, when served on pewter, will leach out the lead. They really are poisonous when served that way, which is why it was a common idea that tomatoes were poisonous in the late 1700s. Many taverns and coffee houses acted as only houses. In other words, they were places for gay men to meet up. Which was easy enough if they were men only. And some coffee houses did have a strict ban on women. So here we have a nice little tavern scene. A fellow is playing a fiddle here. We've got a couple dancing, older gentleman with his pipe smoking near the fire. The continual dog in the tavern. There is somebody tapping a pint here to draw off. And I believe this is a sailor with his arm about the lady here. Not quite a respectable crowd, but certainly having a good time in a tavern here. We also have a lovely bird cage hanging from the ceiling, which looks a little high to me. I don't know how they feed that bird. And a nice lamp against the wall that could be lit up with a nice reflector on it. Oh, there we go. So questions. And feel free to put your questions into the chat or open up your mute and you can ask the question.
At Gunter's, all the books talk about ices, but did they have candies and things like that too?
Yes, they had candies, pastries, ices, tea. They had cordials. In other words, little alcoholic drinks that you could have.
Okay.
So they had a wide range of things. Gunter also catered. So he would make wedding cakes for people. He did a lot of different services. And after the shop actually shut down, he did catering on into the 1950s.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And ices are different than ice cream. They had both. Think of ices more like sherbets, like fruit flavored sherbets, whereas they also had ice cream as well. So you could have both or either. They also had wafers, so you could have a little wafer tucked into your ice cream. Ices were almost always served in a little glass or silver dish. Ice cream cones don't come along till later.
Thank you.
Did children get the same treatment as women in that era?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. Hotels either advertise themselves as being suitable for gentlemen or suitable for families. They don't say ladies welcome, they will say families. So the inference is that if you're a lady, you're traveling with your family. Either a man will be in charge of all the monies and stuff, and you might have your kids with you, but they will be attached to the ladies. Now, if you're talking lower class, not so much. If you're talking lower class, street urchins were around and ran loose. They went into work pretty early. Someone asked, would a woman sit alone with a gentleman at a pastry or tea shop? Not so much tea shops, but definitely at a pastry shop or confectioner's, absolutely. She would not meet him there, she would go with him. In other words, he would escort her to Gunter's, or he would escort her to another pastry shop or a confectioner's. It would be just part of the, going out type of thing. You often see women and gentlemen eating together at a table. Gunter's waiters would also bring, if you're really starchy, you didn't go into Gunter's. You sat outside in your carriage and the waiter carried the ice out to you, or your iced out cream out to you in your carriage, and you sat in your carriage and ate it there and then sent it back with your footman. So that was if you were really starchy, you didn't even go inside. If a group of men and women went to the theater, would they go to a chop house afterwards for supper? More likely to a oyster house, possibly to a if the coffee house served the theater district, that would be the place to go to. So it would be someplace near Covent Garden or near that theater that they would head to. That's why we have that illustration of the infamous oyster house near Covent Garden. And supper is always that late meal. So they called them breakfast. They did have lunches. Lunch was sort of defined as anything you could have in your hand or a very light meal. It would be served at inns and so forth like that. It was sort of to tide you over. Dinner was kind of middle to late afternoon. And if you were getting up late in Regency, London, you might have dinner fairly late. The fashionable did. It kept getting pushed back. And then supper was that late meal usually after 10. And usually after at home, you'd have tea. And tea meant tea and coffee. And then you'd have a supper perhaps late in the evening. A lot of times they talk about lunch as just being cold meats. Other questions? One thing I want to stress too is think about using this to kind of give your characterization. So what your character eats says a lot about their status, how much money do they have in their pocket. And it also says about their preference. You may have an older fellow who just goes out and has his soup for his dinner and a slice of bread, and that's it. And that's all he ever buys. And he goes to the same place and does the same thing. Whereas you might have a more adventurous young man who likes to go down to the docks and try different things. Dinner a bigger meal than supper? Yes. Dinner was pretty much the main meal of the day, and that was the focus for the servants to prepare or anyone else. That's where your big joint of meal would be. If you're dining at home, you might have 2 courses and remous and dessert, and supper would be kind of more of a light meal. In the 1700s, it had been a bigger meal, like the mid 1700s, but gradually over time, as it got pushed later in the day, supper became a lighter, more casual, light fare before you went to bed.
Any other questions? Last call, guys.
Yeah, what about high tea and all that? That's much later, isn't it? And on the different.
Yeah, high tea does not come in. High tea starts off as a Victorian and Edwardian working man's dinner. That's what it starts off as. So it starts off with a workman coming home and having tea and beans on toast, and the Victorians went crazy with canning and sauces on everything. And that's what the Victorian high tea was really a working man's dinner. It's credited to one of the duchesses, I think in 1840, who starts making the fancy tea and having friends over to have it with cakes and stuff like that. Now, if you had visitors, you might serve them refreshments, but it would be just a call for, oh, would you like some tea? And they'd bring in tea and coffee and maybe some light cakes and wafers and biscuits. And I'm talking biscuits in the English term, meaning a cookie to us Americans. So that would be the light fare that you might serve. It might also include some fruit. If you're in the countryside, you might even say, oh, would you care for some cold meats? We'll have them brought in, that sort of thing. So high tea really starts with the Victorians, and the Edwardians are the ones who turn it into an art form in the hotels. The age of the grand hotels starts with the Edwardians, and they're the ones who take off with it and turn it into this extravaganza, like the Ritz and Fortnum and Mason serve as this cream cakes and all this other fol-de-rol and stuff. So that's when that really takes off. And that's because there's a middle class now who can afford to pay for it because they think they're emulating their betters. That's where high tea comes from. I should also mention tea is extremely popular It is also smuggled. So if you're looking for something to smugglers to take, it's tea. Very, very popular with smugglers. A light cargo and made you a lot of money. Any other questions?
Were tea and coffee expensive in that time?
Tea was very expensive. It had several grades. So you had your very expensive black, and they drank both black and green. It all came from China. There was a tax involved on it, and that's why it was kept locked up if you had it at home, because it was so expensive. It was highly adulterated. You had to be careful where you bought it from. Twinings existed during this era, and many people bought from Twinings because they could be assured of good quality tea. A lot of the less reputable tea vendors would adulterate it with all sorts of leaves that were not tea leaves. It would not give you a very good tea. Your Bohea or Pico were your best black teas. Then you had very good Souchong green teas. And then it went down from there, and your cost went down from there. And you could buy it by the pound if you could afford it that way, or you could buy it by smaller. The tea bags were invented, I think it was early 1900s, and they started off in the early 1900s as samples. It was how a tea person put their samples out. And you get tea from India more in the late 1800s, not in a Regency period. So Regency period, it's all coming from China. And no tea bags, it's all loose. Coffee was less expensive, but harder to prepare at home, because guess what? You get whole beans. You have to grind them up, and that's grinding by hand. And then you have to make your coffee, and that all takes time. I'm doing a Academe class this fall on food, and we'll go deeply into costs of tea and cost of goods and recipes and stuff like that this fall.
That's right. That's going to be Regency Food and Seasons. And that's coming up in August, isn't it, Shannon? I'm keeping you very busy.
I think it is. Yeah. It's mostly done. So I'm just putting finishing touches on it, but it's going to be very detailed.
Ooh, we can't wait. So exciting. So
I love food.
we love hearing you talk about food, Shannon. So it works out. All right, guys. Any other questions? Last call. Well, thank you so much to Shannon for doing all of these amazing Zoom presentations. We appreciate it so, so much. And any other questions, guys, you can put them into the chat. We've still got lots of lessons happening in the forums for the rest of the month. And thank you everyone so much. And thank you again, Shannon.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.